Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about alien embryos and stuff. Okay, so look, I've basically come back from holiday for a week, and while I was there, I was mostly doing uni study stuff, but I put out like the September roundup for my Patreon for things I've worked on, and inside of that, I noted how one project I've wanted to do for a long time is a speculative convergent evolution type project, basically trying to visualize what alien life might look like on a spectrum going from realistic to super fictional. It's something I'm really interested in. I haven't really done it before, and it would be like a good avenue to get back into sculpting, one of the, many side projects that I'm doing. So I actually put it to the test. While I was away, I thought, let me start doing some style tests. I mean, it's what you're seeing on the screen now. I will be making this available to my Patreon, or to my patrons, rather, on the $5 tier and above. But let's just talk a bit about the techniques. So there are multiple files. What we're looking at here is the basic, okay, here's your creature file, which has some nice lighting, which can be, modified in various ways. I was playing around with a lot of backlit stuff, as you can tell. There's a lot of subsurface transmission going on, and we've got some internal organ-like structures, but they are largely just tests. So they're not realistic in any way. There's just some spheres in here. We've got a kind of skinned single edge object that's been thickened and with subsurf applied that's kind of going through, and you can think about it a bit like a spinal column in some way, but it's just a single object. Like I said, they're tests. They're supposed to represent if I did want to do realistic organ structures or cartilage and stuff like that, what would it look like in terms of the transmissibility of it? And it looks quite good. There's even things in here we can see where you can start kind of bleeding color through. So this is like a kind of soft tissue material, and it's actually volume based, but you can still get color variety and stuff in there. So I've been, testing all this stuff. What should be actual surface based? What should be volume based? What should be subsurf? What should be transmission? And how do we blend that together? The method that I settled on for getting this visual was, instead of doing it all material based, we're going to use geometry proximity to define where the surface should change. So if I go into my wireframe view, you see that the actual creature sculpt looks like this. It's the sculpt itself, but it's surrounded by these spheres. They don't have to be spheres. I'm using spheres as probes to get geometry proximity data. Notice that there's spheres around where we have these almost fin-like areas poking out, and then there's spheres closer to where we have the kind of transmission, like the belly area. So these are actually split into two different objects. There's distance sub and distance trans. So distance sub is for subsurf, and distance trans is for transmission. If I go into the edit mode, we can see which is which. Now, you don't have to use spheres. Actually, it's a little bit inefficient doing it this way using spheres, because really we only need a vertex or an edge or a face. So there is a lot of efficiency that can be done, in terms of improvements. But what happens is, and I don't know how easy this will be to see with this current lighting setup, but if I move this sphere around, maybe over here, it actually increases the subsurf of that area. So again, let me try again. Hang on. It's so subtle. We just got a little bit of pink there. Let me try moving it down to this belly area, change the angle because we're a bit too far away. Let's move it in. Okay, so the probe is now under this belly area. It may not look that different, but if I delete the vertices, now it goes back to gray. Do you see that? So then bring them back. Pinky. It may also be more apparent if I select on the material. Let me darken. There we go. So we can see it much more there. So this is more kind of technically finite, a bit harder to work with, but the results are quite good. Now with the transmission, again, there are probes in very specific areas. We can see we've got a blue sphere in there, blue sphere with the belly, and a blue one down here. If I go into the material and amplify the colors for those areas, you can see we're effectively masking where the transmissibility is. So again, the point of this paradigm is, so we don't have to do any kind of texturing for the sculpt, and we also don't have to define the gradients of where the material becomes subsurface and transmissive inside of the shader with kind of vector gradients and stuff like that. I haven't tried this, but it would be interesting to use the grease pencil, as if when we have the sculpt, we move around it and then we draw the grease pencil in areas where we want it to become kind of translucent. In terms of the material, now this is where I probably shouldn't show you the whole thing because, I want to put it on Patreon, etc., but I will show you a bit. So let me rearrange my UI a little bit. The material looks like this. It's 3 layers. Your regular physical surface, represented by this principal BSDF over here. You've got your subsurf shader, represented by this one. And you got your transmissive shader, represented by this one. And additional layers could be added. So if I just plug in the regular physical one, the sculpt looks like this. And There's nothing wrong with that. Looks cool as hell. Okay, so I could do my entire series of artwork just using that. It's actually my new favorite material. I need to update my Blender startup file on Gumroad with this material as well, but I'll talk a bit more about that soon, and I love it. Looks great. But with this probe object for the subsurf, I use the geometry proximity data from that to inform where this subsurf shader should be placed. Now, I can tell you a bit more about that in terms of how do we get that proximity data, but since we're here in the material, let's take a look. I've got an attribute node, got the input called distance sub, and that's informing a mix shader node with our subsurf material. So what I can do now is, because it's effectively acting as a layer, I can plug in the regular physical shader plus the subsurf shader to the output. And that gives us this. So we go from something that's just like completely physical and hard, like a rock, to a rock plus some, skin-like see-through element. And that's a different style, and it's still cool. It's not completely realistic, but it gives us a bit more of that, kind of physical spatial definition. But keeping them as separate shaders allows us to get really creative with the values. So we still have control over all the things like, sheen and coat, in case you wanted to make just the subsurf areas like a bit more kind of shiny around the edge for creative effect. Almost makes it look a little bit like, I don't know, wet or mucusy. Like, you can play with that. Maybe I should actually leave that up a little bit now that I'm looking at it. Interesting. Okay, I'll save that. And then again, the next layer, the attribute that we're plugging in is the distance trans. In this case, I've got it passed through a color ramp. We can talk a bit more about the fall-offs of geometry proximity when we take a look at geometry nodes. But again, the same principle applies. We're actually passing the mask of the geometry proximity as a factor to the mix shader, and we've got a separate shader providing the transmission. So when I plug that in, then it starts becoming transmissive. So in terms of creative control, we have these distinct layers and these distinct physical properties that we can apply, but they're all optional. So again, physical, subsurf, transmission. And we're kind of compounding that logic together. Maybe let me turn that code down a little bit. Okay, cool. But how do we get the geometry proximity? Okay, well, it's quite simple. On the actual sculpt object, and I should say I'm using Blender version 4.5.3 LTS. You know how geometry nodes changes. What I'm about to tell you may not work exactly the same way. Okay, so the regular method of doing it, which I'm using, is like this. So this is the simplest way. For each layer of this material logic, object info is where you bring in your geometry proximity object. So in this case, distance sub, which again, if we take a look, distance sub has these kind of probe spheres around defining where the subsurf should be. Pass that relative through a geometry proximity node. I've got it on points. Take the distance value, pass it through a map range so you can control. The ranging is the equivalent of putting it through like a color ramp, but you get a bit more control. And then you can define the curve. So that's basically how linear you want the offset to be from the geometry proximity. If I make that harsh like this and then modify the curve, there we go. You should be able to see how that changes, and we can really tighten it up as well. So the curve here defines your fall off for the proximity. And then what you do is you pass that value as an output in the group output node. And I try and keep all the names consistent. So I call the output distance sub. I call the object distance sub. But then importantly, this is how you access it. In that geometry nodes tree on your sculpt object, under output attributes, there will be values that appear since you've now plugged them into the output. Go into the value, and I also type in distance sub. So that's basically defining the name for the attribute there. And then again, in the shader editor, you bring that in attribute node, geometry, distance sub, the factor value. So again, it's a bit of a complex paradigm maybe when comparing it to like regular shader editing, but individually all these things are simple. It's simple in the geometry nodes to bring that proximity data to the output. It's simple in the outliner. It's just another object. It's simple in the shader editor, how you bring it in. It's hard to remember like every step. I'm sure there are other ways to do it. This is just the paradigm I've been working with. Now, there is a bit of a limitation in that when I'm rotating the sculpt object, it's quite slow and laggy. That is because, again, talking about efficiency, you don't need to use a sphere. I was only using a sphere because it was just easy to see. In reality, we only need like a face, or I don't actually know if a single vertex works, but like a single face would work. So we've got all this unnecessary geometry that's like wasting compute time. So I'm aware of that, but it looks good for now. What I did was I took those proximity objects, since they're now defining how the material changes around the creature, and I made them children of the sculpt. So it means that as we change the position and rotation of it, we're going to keep the subsurf and the transmission in exactly the same place around the creature. Okay, we haven't even covered the other files for this, and the time's already getting on. This is a problem I'm having at the moment. I've got so many things to talk about and share that I'm having decision paralysis about what order to share things in, what order to upload files in, what order to make the videos in. So let me quickly jump to a more advanced file. Embryo in tube number 4. No, that's the wrong one. Embryo in tube number 3. Okay. So this file is interesting because I think it's the most complex render setup I've ever done in Blender. Maybe not the most complex. It's the most maybe the most complex for the smallest space. It's combining a lot of techniques, especially things from Afterglow combined with this new shading paradigm for the creature. So if I go into the rendered view again, we're far away, so this is not how you're actually supposed to see it. But what you can see is happening here is I've got a creature in a test tube. There is volume. There are lights above and below providing emission from a shader source. There's actually 2 regular spot lamps, which I don't tend to use regular lamp objects unless I really need to. In this case, it was for punching light, really high intensity for a finite space, like a laser. And the result of that is something like this. So here it's almost like a scientific study of the creature where we're using the context of this tube, maybe it'll be something like full of formaldehyde if you wanted, to see the internal structure of the creature. Looks cool. But from this, we can get other angles. Here's a far away 4K one, here's a vertical, here's an interesting one. So when we zoom in through the glass, through the volume, with the light passing through the transmission subsurf, at a really tight focal distance like this, you can get something that's quite cinematic. And this is the reason why this is like my new favorite shader, because we get the highlights from the curvature of the sculpt. This is like a very physically defined part of the material. It blends into something transmissive. We can see the internals. We get a little bit of color bleed from the subsurf, and this just keeps phasing in and out throughout the creature. So it gets more physical again with the definition from the sculpt, gets more transmissive again, etc., etc. But all of it is controllable from this kind of geoproximity probe paradigm. From here, we get the lighting. There's a ring from Afterglow. You may know recently I did a light shapes update and there's some geometry in there. This is one of those geometries from the Afterglow update. We get some of the shadowing from the light rings that are physical. The spotlights are pushing light through. And we get something that's just cool as heck. Like, I love it. What I've done is I've taken different angles of this as well. So we can get like a really close up of the creature face in the tube. And, you know, more kind of like abstract-y X-ray-ish angles. But what we can also do with this is I took like the lighting and I put it on a pivot. So some camera angles are on a pivot where the lighting changes, but the creature stays the same. Or rather, the creature stays fixed, and we can rotate the camera around with the lighting. So it means that we can see our creature in context with the light staying constantly balanced as it's pushing it through the creature. Now it's quite hard to tell until it resolves, but I think you can see that the results are quite cool. So we can kind of move around and inspect it, get cool renders, keeping that cinematic feel. If you want to add a bit more clarity, you can remove the volume, right? And again, still cool. So we can rotate from there, see the creature in its tube. We can actually see the curvature quite a lot more there. Now, these files will be put on my Patreon. Variations of things from these files will also be put onto other products. The material will be added to my startup file on Gumroad. The lighting I've worked on will be added to a future Afterglow update. Also, that material will be in Afterglow as well. This is the thing about working on experimental projects like this. It's kind of like, you know, how the Blender Studio, you know, they work on short films and now video games. You take the lessons you learn from them, you feed them back into the software. This is like one of those projects for me. Something I wanted to do. I learned a bunch of lessons in terms of materials and lighting. Now I've got to feed those back into my other things. Modular workspaces should also get a little update from this in terms of the asset library, because that kind of test tube setup is something that I would like to recycle as a standard like collection asset for starter projects. So my startup file and Afterglow and modular workspaces and the Patreon should all get something from this. But it may take a while for me to like individually siphon off, clean up, package, upload. And especially for the larger projects, they may be put on hold until I've got more things for an update. Basically, there's a lot to do. Again, I mentioned decision paralysis. The point is, I hope you found this interesting, maybe inspiring. What else can I show? Okay, so this is a sculpt from no-3d.at on Sketchfab. What we're looking at here is a creative reinterpretation of the embryo material, but recycling it for a different artistic use case. So here we have a traditional sculpt object. Again, this is a statue scan from that's noe-3d.at on Sketchfab. We're using exactly the same shading principle. So we have the basic physical shading here, although it has the roughness turned down a little bit. So it's a bit more reflective. I suppose you could use that for like jewelry or whatever, but let me balance it out a bit more. Then we add in some subsurf probing with color. So again, this is just a different way of doing the procedural shading. Gives me a bit more control. And then we can add in some transmission. And with this, I find it's really useful for doing like sculpt demonstrations, because you can get so much like interesting color and shading bleed that you wouldn't traditionally be able to get. So I've got different versions of this file. Let's take a look. In this case, it's darker, but we get this almost like jade-like bleed through that's red. And I find that really cool because you can kind of define what parts of the object you want to be red. Maybe you can use that for storytelling. You know, maybe like a spear is going through something and you want to have that red light bleed going on with it. We can actually see the probing. In this case, I'm combining the same probes for subsurf and transmission, which doesn't always work well because of the fall-offs, but in this case it does. You just want to keep it far enough away from the object. But let's say I take this sphere and I move it like over here. We just saw it appear by the front legs. By the face we can see it, but we can see there's this weird fall-off thing going on. Again, that's just because we're using the same probe for both types. So that's not really a problem. If I can just choose the subsurf, but I can also go straight back into the geoprocs, change the fall-offs. It's kind of the opposite direction to what I wanted. Let me turn down the from min a little bit. There, yeah, that might make it a bit more subtle, but you can kind of see how that works. So I'm finding it really interesting working with this alternative shading paradigm, but yeah, I'll keep working with it. And finally here I have, I did my recent scan of Mercury from Walmer Castle. And as a test, I tried refurbishing the scan because it was really messy. And I did some sculpting of my own with keyboard and mouse to like reconstruct the hands and feet and stuff. And this was a test of using my new physical material to see how well it can just like highlight the contours from the sculpt without actually being too overwhelming. So this one's not using probes at the moment, but it was a nice material test. Anyway, that's gone on for a little while. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, you can do a whole bunch of things. I recommend you check out my products and resources, codesol.online/store. Got a lot of really cool lighting and material tools in there, of which there will be updates for the future. Also the Patreon, codesol.online/Patreon. We have a members lounge. You can download these files. Again, they may not be available yet because everything is out of order for me at the moment, but just keep an eye on this channel. I'll announce when things are released. But also you can sign up to the Patreon for free. And if you do that, you'll get like a monthly newsletter-like post in the email, which is like a combined list of everything that I've released. But again, the exclusive files are for the $5 tier members and above. We also have a Discord server if you want to pop along, share your work, maybe join the helper community as well. You can find a link to that on my website at codesol.online/links. Okay, so, if you did make it to the end, put a light bulb emoji in the comments, or a creature emoji, alien, microbe, whatever you like. That will show me if you made it this far. Have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.